Welcome again to the Information Literacy Summit. Thank you for joining us in breakout room D. We feel free to use the chat. I'm co-moderating this session with my colleague from DePaul, Holly Cerny. My name is Jill King. Please feel free to message us in the chat if you need anything during the session, and also use the chat to comment or ask any questions of our presenters. They'll be addressing questions at the end of their session today. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started right away. I am very pleased to introduce our presenters, Sarah Steiger and Kara Thorstenson from the Chicago Public Schools. Thanks for being here with us, and I'll hand it over to you both.
Thanks for having us today, Jill. I'm Sarah Steiger. I'm manager of libraries for Chicago Public Schools. Prior to joining CPS in 2020, I have been a school librarian for 10 years, really focusing in on building culturally responsive collections, policy, programming, hiring practices, really how that equates to building a more anti-racist library system.
Hi guys, I'm Kara Thorstenson. I'm the Director of Libraries and Instructional Technology for Chicago Public Schools, and I've been in this role at CPS almost 4 years. It's wonderful to be here. And then you can also see our teammate Anna depicted on this slide, who rounds out our libraries team. She will not be joining us, but she is here in spirit.
All right, so we always like to sort of ground our presentations that we give with the vision and mission of the work that we do every day here in CPS. It drives our work and sort of reminds us what we're trying to accomplish every single day. And so we really work to empower the librarians across our district as educational leaders, where we provide equitable and culturally responsive resources in all content areas, and we actively champion curiosity and a lifelong love of literature for every learner at CPS, and we consider our students as well as our staff to be all learners. We provide a ton of culturally relevant training. It's all we focus on, our resources, our networking opportunities, and we develop pipelines to grow librarians and librarianship in CPS, where we currently have 1 in 6 schools is staffed with a librarian. All right, so this is sort of our agenda today. We really want to get you thinking about what metadata and equity means. If you haven't really considered that yet, we'll have some questions about that and get our brains sort of warmed up. We will then discover a little bit about our program and how we landed on the critical cataloging project, talk a little bit about it. And then because we're in sort of a truncated meeting today, we're going to give you a lot of opportunity to have access to resources that we use for planning your next steps. And then throughout this whole presentation, we'll stop and talk. We really try to make this engaging to hear what you're thinking, hear what you're wondering, talking with one another. So we try to embed places along the way for us to engage with you. So that's where we're going to start. We want to know and think about, from your end, what are the ways that equity is already showing up in collection development in your district? So how are you already doing this work? How are you already engaged in it? Tell us what you're thinking about. And if you haven't started it yet, that's okay too.
We have a comment in the chat that says, I'm trying to get us to consider decolonizing the catalog, but it is a big task. And then I also see budget allocations for special collections, training to look for alternative sources for collecting resources.
Right. There's a lot of different ways that we begin our inroads into a more equitable and responsive collection. And this part that we're talking about today, I see DEI coming up in the chat as well. our approach has been, we've kind of moved on to the next step from talking about the content to today we'll talk to you a little bit about what the metadata looks like. So hang on, I can't see, I've got a lot going on. Kara, are you on this slide?
What are the ways that equity shows up or is absent in collection development?
Great, thank you. Okay, so we want to talk to you a little bit about the ways that we answer this question here at CPS. We have to actively acknowledge our bias in being the selectors of content and knowing that that impacts what we're deciding to bring into collections in our libraries. We talk about community triggers. That's how equity can show up or be absent. Diverse library selection committees, doing equity audits. If you do that, if you don't do that, I saw that come up in the text too. And even the physical arrangement of our space can impact how equitable a collection is. Finally, we always like to call out that 88% of librarians are white women. According to the Racial Equity Alliance, this number has increased over the years. So inherently, like, the hiring practices of this field are inequitable. And so we call this out, we call attention to it to our colleagues to understand that we're working in a place that is not equitable in its systemic practices. So knowing that, what might be the ways that the equity can be absent from collection development currently in your collection? You can add it in the chat. You can feel free to come off mute to share your thoughts. We're a small group today, so feel free to speak and show yourselves.
I see the comment, not using the language of the communities in the cataloging subjects or tags.
Absolutely.
And also not systematic overview in place and incomplete cataloging.
Sure, all of those things will impact it. We'll dig into some of those comments a little bit deeper into the presentation. So I'm glad that there was call out about community keywords.
Also lack of input from patrons and not asking our communities for the language they feel being important or engaging.
Could not agree with that more, Mackenzie.
Yeah, we use that as a case study to talk about a step for us to use when you're updating your catalog. So we like to reference windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors. We in any of our presentations, sometimes we don't really know where people are coming into this conversation and where they're at in their journey of learning. And so when Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop is really a huge force in terms of the concept of windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors, where when children or any learner can't find themselves reflected in the books they read, or when the images they see are distorted, negative, or laughable, they learn a powerful lesson about how they are devalued in the society of which they are a part. Our classrooms need to be places where all children from all cultures that make up the salad bowl of American society can find their mirrors. So we really seek to build a responsive catalog from the content they access to the ways in which they see themselves show up in the metadata. When the pandemic began, we were really at that point, we were talking a lot about how critical content was with the concept of Sims Bishop, but then we started talking about access, and access was just as important, and the delivery of the content was just as critical as the content that we were delivering. And so we want to call out explicitly what we're talking about when we're talking about critical cataloging and what metadata is and how it can be inflammatory. So the I word is this concept of illegal alien and the process of what's happened over the years with OCLC and that language and terminology in the the Library of Congress's catalog. So in 2014, students, educators, and librarians started advocating that the subject heading was inflammatory, and then this led to the use of non-citizens and unauthorized immigration. So this change and many other changes like it speak to the power of examining and criticizing our classification and cataloging practices in making our systems of knowledge organization less racist. So we now see that illegal alien has transitioned, and this change occurred in November, technically, of last year. So it was over the course of 7 years advocating for this one key word to change. And so what we're looking, sorry, give me a second to. So our project, Critical Cataloging, recognizes the way that this classification system, codifying language, withholds and upholds prejudicial language. We've done searches on LOC catalog, and you can see where what we're talking about, you can see the keyword of illegal alien come up on this title. All right. This search was accessed on October 29th through our team, 2021. So theoretically, the changes implemented would have gone into place and updated the catalog, and that language would no longer be there. But that's not the case. On March 9th, we did another search again for the same title, and the same language is still there. So there has not been change, even though that one word that we was advocated for years for change has not been implemented systemically. And this is one particular title we searched for. We also want to give some context to OCLC subject determination, like how the language is determined, especially if we have school librarians here, people who are not catalogers. We are not catalogers. OCLC looks at keyword and subject heading from a judicious standpoint. So how language is interpreted by our legal system. And that's really critical for you to know, depending on what sort of system you're supporting. Are you in a school library? Are you in an academic library? What kind of language what sort of lens should you be using for your key stakeholders when building out metadata? It doesn't necessarily mean just because OCLC is the tantamount of metadata doesn't mean that's the one that's most appropriate for your community. So we really advocate and call this part out because we want you to have a critical lens when thinking about the language that's most appropriate for the community that you serve.
So in response to all of this, and like to extend the work of identifying illegal alien as, or not jumping on the bandwagon, but pursuing the elimination of that terminology within our own catalog, we put together a critical cataloging project. It was actually kind of kicked off by our teammate Dorsey Chambers, who retired in December after 35 years with Chicago Public Schools. And so it's a little coalition of teacher librarians, folks from our team, and a lot of internal and external partners who are working to adjust the subject headings and keywords at our local level. So, you know, as Sarah mentioned at the beginning of this session, we have 642 schools in Chicago Public Schools, but we do not have a school library or a staffed school library in the majority of those schools. However, the catalog is ours to manage however we see fit. And we are really fortunate to have a full-time technical guy that, you know, helps manage our catalog. And so we're able to make changes that are universal to Chicago Public Schools, which is a comparatively large audience. But it probably, hopefully goes without saying that we are not able to, nor at this time do we particularly wish to, exert control over other like citywide catalogs or organizations, although we have big dreams, right? So we're identifying terminology with our team, with the group that is historically racist, sexist, ableist, and heteronormative, working with experts to and our community to identify appropriate alternate language, and then calling the shot about what to do with that language in our catalog. And we'll get into the kind of our options or the ways we can make edits in a moment. So we first convened in winter of 2020, and generally have monthly meetings. So basically early on, we were just kind of getting a feel for like, we were getting the lay of the land basically, and trying to explore what had been going on around the country already with regard to critical cataloging. You know, for us, like until my team kicked it off, like this work was not particularly on my radar. And then obviously to echo what one of our attending librarians mentioned about Mackenzie, about not asking our communities for the language that they feel is important. You know, for us, we hadn't even asked ourselves what language we felt was important. You know, we were going just off of records for the texts that are sold to school districts. K-12 districts are predominantly just auto-generated, and we just get them from the vendors, right? So there isn't even, you know, there's no cataloger on our team that writes subject headings for us, custom or otherwise. So you know, once we sort of knew where we were headed, or we had identified what I would call like the low-hanging fruit of either most offensive, most dated, or most questionable terminology, then we were able to bring together stakeholders to help us identify, to like help us to confirm that what we had chosen was correct in terms of needing an update, and then helping us identify the more appropriate language. So, I mean, for us, partnerships matter. You know, Sarah mentioned earlier about how librarianship is predominantly white women, which I think, I mean, like, you know, it doesn't take a really observant observer to identify that. And so therefore our team is not really the entities who should be calling shots for language, especially about populations that we are not a part of. So in our case, we're really fortunate, obviously, to be in the city of Chicago, to be in a school district as diverse as Chicago Public Schools, and to have a big internal community. You know, there's over 30,000 adults work for CPS, but even within the organization, you know, we have an office of equity, we have an office of student health and wellness. We have, and outside of that, we have a teacher population of 30,000 and a student population of 330,000, upon whom we can draw to learn more about how our community self-identifies and how they would want language in our catalog to be addressed. So through, like, you know, this lists our categories of partners, but you know, we try to be as wide reaching as possible. And we've been really lucky to have really knowledgeable partners who've been very generous with their time as well. So this is a list of our teacher librarians and CPS that have been a part of this work thus far on the left. And then on the right are the partner organizations, many of whom are the entities with which we do business. Like you can imagine, you know, and I think that K-12 shops differently from university level, but, you know, our catalog is through the Library Corporation. And then we purchase texts from the next four listed: Mac and Follett, Overdrive, Scholastic. Capstone provides us both print and digital text, as well as online resources for like primary school research for like early learners. We've worked with the Newberry Library as well as the Chicago History Museum. And it's really helpful for us to have our vendor partners engaged in the work because, as I mentioned earlier, we get our records from them. So when we were talking about, so once we moved on from the practice of discussing illegal alien, which, you know, was sort of not the spark that lit the fire by any stretch, but what we talk about in our presentations frequently is like low-hanging fruit, in the way that there's not a lot of people, we don't believe, who would self-identify as an illegal alien. And so there's not as much like necessarily controversy or discussion from the community that calls themselves illegal aliens, who would want to make sure they're like appropriately represented. And that's not, of course, as true for a lot of other language that's used within our records. So then when we moved on to talk about, Hispanic Americans and what language we wanted to use to reconsider how those populations were identified in the catalog, we went to the districts and asked students and educators. And you can see that there's a wide variety of language by which people self-identify. The school district has really adopted the term Latinx, and that's what's really used a lot in internal communications. And like, if we're talking about our Latinx population of students, doing X, Y, or Z. But what we learn and what you can see from this graph is that a lot of our community members don't identify with the term Latinx. And so for me, it was very enlightening for us to learn about how people self-identify, but also the variety of language, and then trying to figure out how we were going to be able to incorporate that meaningfully into our records when, and so which sparked then the conversation that I think is on some upcoming slides about, are we replacing terms like flat out, like deleting illegal alien from the record and changing it to undocumented immigrant? Or are we doing what we call embellishment, which is adding to ensure that we're not removing language that not only do some people not consider offensive or outdated, but that they identify as or with. And in a lot of cases, that's been more effective for us because we're not just replacing one word that people don't consider describing themselves with a different word.
Just to add to that, I think the really big takeaway for us was we had initially met, we were discussing and very, very adamant in a small group of librarians saying, okay, well, Hispanic is more of an antiquated term. And this was predominantly, white librarians. However, there were librarians of color joining in the conversation too. And from the perspective of a small subset of people that were together that thought we were being culturally responsive in our choice and saying, okay, well, let's move towards Latinx, that there was such a disconnect by what came up and was elevated from our community engagement. And so it was really great that we saw the disconnect from the beginning, because it was a huge lesson for our team in this work, and that we consistently need to go back to groups of people and ask community what they prefer in terms of the language in which they're classified and categorized. So what we want you to think about is how might you begin the process of examining the subject headings in your own school's catalog? What terminology might start with? Kara mentioned our first sort of case study, and we went with the Latino population here in CPS because there's a really heavy representation of folks in our community. And so that was something that was why we prioritized that language. Might be different for your community though. So I want you to start thinking about and thinking about, like, where's the place that I might start with this exploration? Where might I start digging into the catalog with this critical lens? What language might I start with? What words or keywords or subject matter might I try to explore to begin this process of looking really critically at the catalog? I invite you to add your thoughts to the chat. You might inspire somebody else to start with your idea. Feel free to come off mute as well.
This is me asking a question rather than commenting. How did you assemble these focus groups to look at language in terms of asking from the community?
So we generally have a captive audience here in a fixed environment in libraries. So our librarians went to the schools and their students and asked. So they delivered a form, I believe is what went through. And so they were able to check the language that they selected. It was also shared out with our staff members. And then it was also shared with parents. And so we were able to pull from multiple stakeholders to get informed feedback.
Yeah, one of the comments is seems like establishing who the stakeholders are in this process would be first for them. And the comment, I'm an academic librarian who is in a reference position. I'm starting with our juvenile collection, and honestly, using those are the jumping off point.
Right.
And then I see, I looked at the cataloging lab, and then there was a link in the chat for the cataloging lab, which I'm unfamiliar with.
Me too.
Yeah, there's a ton of resources out there. Actually, today there's even another session. I can grab the resource. I think it's like, it might coincide with the Information Literacy Summit, but there's a session that's out there today on anti-racist language in our metadata. So like, you can find it everywhere. It will really pop up once you start looking for it. Kara, do you want to take this slide?
Yeah. So I mentioned briefly, really quick, I want to just address, Dana, your comment about not knowing how to get your peers on board. Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of teammates or folks that work in your library or in your organization, I think that's more of an invitation, right? And like, if this work feels urgent to you or feels meaningful to you, it's very likely that it does to other librarians or other library adjacent folks in your organization. And then I guess if that's not the case and you're not finding a lot of enthusiasm, I would just encourage you to reach out to other entities in Chicagoland, or I mean across the country, who are doing this work. I mean, you can connect with us. I understand that I don't believe, but I'm not 100% that there's other K-12 leadership folks on this call, like library folks, but if you are, great. And if not, the work can look similar. So I understand your point that it can be like adding another project to everyone's ever growing list of things to do. But I think you saw our list of teacher librarians, like there's a lot of enthusiasm right now for this work and a lot of like interest and excitement. So I mentioned briefly about embellishing versus removing terms. Sarah, can you like click again so the slide populates? Thanks. Sure. So we're saying like embellishment in our case is about adding to, when you looked at our graph of language that folks self-identified as who are Hispanic, Latino, Latine, it really wasn't for us, or I mean, I would argue any entity, to say like, okay, we're going to throw all the terms in a hat, we're going to pick out the latest one, and then we're going to delete everything else, because you guys know just as well as we do that what's considered to be appropriate or contemporary language continues to change. So in this case, we're embellishing by adding keywords or subject headings to a primary search term, and that happens instead of removing language. And so I think throughout our process, over the last couple of years, we've done more embellishment than we have just flat out removing terms. Mm-hmm. And so then the next question would be like, why not just remove the offensive term altogether? And it's basically, what's the purpose of us maintaining records and subject headings in the first place, right? To help people find the materials that they want. So if we're actively removing language that folks would use to self-identify and also to potentially look for a book, I mean, fundamentally, that's what this work is all about. And so we don't want to exclude people. And then we also want to be able to empower librarians, so we're in a role, and a lot of you guys are too, where our librarians are teaching students how to access learning materials and teaching students how to access books. So we want them to be able to articulate how and where students can find materials using language that they consider most appropriate, or as wide a variety of appropriate language as possible. We're planning to phase out outdated terms in particular cases, but that's a work in progress too, because we don't have like a centralized library curriculum. We meet with our teacher librarians, we talk to them, we email them, but the work looks extremely different from school to school. And so we don't have like, we don't have a structure where we're telling librarians, okay, by the end of next month, you've got all your students need to know that this term is being removed. Like, that's not meaningful. And it also isn't necessarily applicable to the work you'd be doing with like 5th graders or 7th graders. So finally, the last question on here says, are you keeping the offensive subject headings? And, our response is eventually old subject headings will be completely replaced with updated headings, but that timeline could look very long, especially in situations where multiple terms are widely used and widely agreed upon by subpopulations or whatever, to not be offensive or not be of concern or be the primary term by which an entity or a group would self-identify.
So in practice, like illegal alien has been completely removed from our catalog. In practice, slaves has been entirely removed from our catalog. So particularly inflammatory language has been completely removed from our catalog.
So we've got a laundry list of the experts we've been able to call on. And for those of you that are intimidated by the thought of starting a project like this, like, please know that we didn't pay a penny for any of this support. And I don't necessarily say that because, you know, we're advocating to get all your help for free, you know, but we are really fortunate that there's a lot of people with a lot of knowledge and experience that are willing to join us for an hour-long virtual meeting. And, you know, and articulate clearly, get teed up, and then explain what, talk about like the most appropriate contemporary terminology. And for a lot of us also reveal language that either wasn't on our radar at all, or identify things that were even news to us, especially when we talked about like physical disabilities and like some of that language that was very informative to me. Like I had a lot to learn there for sure. And so you can see too that throughout this, there's a lot of folks from Chicago Public Schools as well. We've got our teammates for sexual health and wellness, and then we've got colleagues from the Office of Equity. And so we're really fortunate in that regard that you know, we can just call our colleagues. But we've got ringers here from a lot of different organizations and entities, and most people, I think, were you know, happy, maybe you know, maybe excited to be part of this work and to help advise us.
So this is here to help you. There are links for many of these people with an underlined name. There are email addresses. So if you land on a term that you're ready to start exploring and you are not an expert around that group of people, call on an expert that is here on this list who has supported this practice with CPS. They understand what this project is. If you send a cold call and you're like, I don't know where to go, these are the people that can help you. And so that's why it's here. We're here sharing this with you. So basically, all of our sessions that we've had over the past year with these experts tend to be like, we do a cold call. We say, we're working on this project to learn more about culturally responsive language in terms of the group that you support, that you have, you know, your coalition that you support on, or whatever it is. And we say, we need some help. We need to look for the right language and we need to hear from you. Can you help us? And generally they're like, yeah, I'm totally down. I'd love to come. And so they come, they do some education for us and the librarians, and we all learn about the language that is culturally responsive right now, language that we should be using that's contemporary. And then we look at it in context of our current catalog, and we talk about it and explore our catalog and see where our blind spots are, the things that we don't know, the things that we've learned over the course of that engagement with that expert. And that helps us contextualize the learning that we're making in terms of the ownership that we have of the catalog. So we hope that this can help you connect with people, because we don't know what we don't know, right? And we don't know, like, we've got to be able to find a place to start. These are the people that can help us and that have helped us.
So, okay, do you want me to take this one? Okay, so thus far, here's where we've gotten with our updates to our Chicago Public Schools catalog. So we embellish illegal aliens with undocumented immigrants. At this point, that term illegal alien is removed from the catalog. Is that right, Sarah?
Yeah, and as well as slaves.
Yeah, and then we removed slaves, and that was just changed to enslaved people. And then for Hispanic, we decided to embellish, you know, as we discussed earlier, with Latino, Latina, and Latine, which was like, Latine was not on my personal radar at the time, when so many of our Latine colleagues said that is, and students and educators said that is their preferred term. So this was informational to us. And so we added our embellishments. You know, you can see we haven't captured every term that was possibly considered in the survey, but we captured the heavy hitters. And then finally, talking about American Indians was embellished with First Nation, Native American, Indigenous peoples, and where applicable, Subject headings will also include the specific tribal identity created by the American government, which could also potentially be linked to original tribal names. So this one is a good example of an endlessly deep pool to jump into. And it's really difficult to say, like, with a straight face that we'd be able to quote unquote get it right with regard to ensuring that people's tribes are correctly identified, et cetera, et cetera. But being able to dive in and just, take on what we can take on is really important when we're talking about identities that go a lot deeper than just the term American Indian, and so that this has been informative. And I think that if this project continues on for 25 years, we're not going to get to a place where we consider discussion of Native American and the language that we use to reach a quote unquote stopping point.
And that actually is applicable to our whole entire catalog. And that's where the place we're at right now. This sort of deviates from where we're going, but I do want to say that language is ever evolving, and perhaps there's even language that we've updated this year that in a couple years we're going to come back to and have to revisit and say, okay, well, now there's been even more changes. And so this project, it could be never ending, and you need to be able to determine, like, once you get through your first round, whatever that means, figuring out how you continue the cadence of the conversation and the project and what your objectives are. Okay, so we want to know what you're thinking about today's session before we dig into sharing more, like, concrete next steps for you. We want to hear what you're thinking and what you're wondering about. So how can we help you? I don't have access to see the chat because I've got the deck up. So if Kara, if you want to read it out, or somebody else.
Sure. Yeah. And there was one question from before as well that was asking if you compare titles on similar subjects from McKinsey, if those that are circulated have different headings.
Can you or the question asker clarify a little bit? Are you talking about a distinction between circulated titles and non-circulated?
Hi, this is Mackenzie. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, sorry. Yeah, I guess I'm wondering, like, if there's a way, so, like, I think some of what I struggle with is, like, being proactive, versus being reactive. And so part of what I'm thinking about is, is there data somewhere in the ways that we have access to, I guess, that would point to, like, oh, so, like, looking at titles that are somewhat, like, within a similar subject and seeing, well, this title has checked out 35 more times than this other title. And when I look at the subject headings, not that they're going to be a one-to-one, obviously, but, like, are there differences there? Or are there other ways that you might go about doing that kind of analysis? Does that make more sense?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Like, we don't, frankly, not to put too fine a point on it, like, you're looking at half of our libraries team is here with you today. We don't have the capacity to stand up a research project like that. That actually would be the coolest thing. And a lot of my time right now is spent professionally being like, wow, if someone was going to pay for me to go get my PhD, I would love to do research on X, Y, or Z. Right now, so the short answer is no. We have no data like that, and it's highly unlikely we're going to develop it, only because we could get reports run from our like technical guy that manages the catalog, but there's so much variety. There's no consistency with what's in individual school collections. There's no consistency on how titles circulate or when or where they circulate to students. So, we got a lot of variables basically, but I like the cut of your jib, and it's really fascinating. And I wonder if we'd be able to find data like that that other entities have, like, put together.
Yeah.
I would suggest to talk to Violet Fox. For sure.
Yeah, she and I have been this is, like, years ago at this point. She and I, like, had a good conversation pre-pandemic. And to be clear, like, I'm also, like, not a cataloger, and we also have a super small team, so I totally understand. Mostly I was just thinking, like, what are other ways that we can, again, like, I think it's really good to ask our patrons what they need and, like, how they identify and all of that, but I also really struggle with the labor of that. And so thinking about ways that we can do more with what we have. And again, maybe it's like a good practicum student project, right? Like get a library student who's interested in
Like
doing
we don't
some of
have,
that.
you know, we don't maintain like a practice of like bringing in like, you know, interns or practicum. It's weird in K-12 because everyone except for the 4 of us and then, you know, probably 5 other people in Illinois. That's not true. Probably 25 other people in Illinois are student facing, are in the school libraries, right? It's very rare for there's very few like administrative positions. So it's not helpful for school librarians to do a practicum with us, you know, unless they're looking to get into administration. But anyways, yeah, your point is very well made. And it's been a dream of mine for a long time to get some interns on this team. It's just really difficult.
No worries. Well, thank you.
Yeah, that's a great observation.
I'm going to dig into some resources that we have available that we want to share with you and make sure that you have access to on your own when we are done with the session. So Kara, if you can drop the deck into the chat again.
Yes.
I am going to dig in a little bit. So this is a practice that we do when we have a longer amount of time dedicated for groups in person to do a little bit of learning, okay? Where we get the ball rolling, we find a buddy to research with, and I'm sharing this practice with you so that you could take it back to your system and potentially implement it on your side. So you find a buddy that you're going to research for 20 minutes, learn a little bit more about the concept. We provide a deck, or basically a placemat of resources that I'll share in a second. And then you go and dive in a little bit on how you are going to make meaning about what you learned today and other questions that you have moving forward. And then you start thinking about the ways in which you're digging into the project. So you might review the collection development policy that you have at your school that might help, or your district that might help drive your work forward. You might copy everything from this drive here today. You might talk to some of the experts we listed. You might review the keywords that we have used and updated and changed that are further along in this presentation that I'll show, or something else. And then you can use any of this from our slides to support the work on your end. So here's our resource board. This is a ton of resources that we have around critical cataloging, metadata, keywords, diversifying your collection, sort of adjacent resources that can help you. All of these are linked here. You're welcome to use these. And then this is sort of a template for you to share out your big ideas as you go through this process on your own. I'm not going to dig into this part here because there's pejorative language that's associated with terminology that might show up in your catalog. It might be there. We use this to share for you to do searches on your own to determine whether or not this language comes up and if you need to remove it from your own catalog. So I'm just going to cruise past this. So our large takeaways we want to give you is that language evolves and your catalog should too. You want to stay attuned to changes that are happening socially and continue to update and figure out a cadence that works for you and your team and your bandwidth to build a more responsive catalog. And then go to people that know the thing. That's the easiest thing. Like, we don't know it. We're here to find the resources. You are not the expert. Find an expert to help you and to have an expert help frame and guide the conversation for you to do some learning. People are already doing the work. So just join into the conversation and figure out your inroads. It doesn't need to be huge to start. You can slowly work your way toward a more responsive catalog with every change that you make.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you both. It's fantastic to hear your perspective as school librarians. And I totally agree with the comment at the end that it's really exciting to, as an academic librarian, to think that, this is what students are coming into our institutions with the expectation of being asked for their input in the way that you have, and seeing themselves reflected more in the catalog, and they can hold us up to those standards as well. At our institutions. So, we probably have a minute or two if anybody has a question they'd like to ask before we wrap up.
I think what we'll also pitch, we've gone out to other districts to support the work like locally and help drive the conversations. So we're open to that too. If you're in the Illinois area, Chicagoland area, we're happy to come out and help you guys run some of these conversations and get the conversation rolling and support you.
That sounds great. Yeah, I was going to ask, it sounds like you've done a session or workshops like this for, is it for other school districts or at other conferences? Yeah, okay, that's great.
Yeah, all of the above.
Cool. Well, great. Thank you again for joining us. It's been a really informative session and a great discussion as well with everyone. Thanks for participating.
Oh, we really appreciate the opportunity. Holly, I'll catch you on the flip
I
side.
know, thank you so much. I'm sure you got to read some of these great comments. Some of them were pretty in depth. But yeah, there was some great feedback, and this is something we definitely struggle with when we're just helping students search and we have them look at the subjects line, that we're always talking about, of like people not feeling represented from, what the collective voice is for these subject headings. So it's great that you have some power to change that within.
Or
If you can talk to EBSCO, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for
Thank
coming.
you. And attendees, we have a lunch break coming up next. So enjoy the lunch and hope to see you at some sessions this afternoon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.